I'm here to take a few questions from the media. I won't make a speech this evening because there'll be a lot of times for that. The debate is coming up, but I'm sure that you have one or two questions to ask me. But let me just say, what we have just done is to have presented to the country probably, I would say, the best budget that we have presented of the 8 that we have had to present. I just want to draw to the attention of the national community that not very long ago, we were in a situation that was dire, and it largely had to do with our accustomed expenditure level and finding ourselves in a situation of significantly reduced revenues. And I recall leading something called a spotlight early on in the early part of the last administration that I led, where we pointed out how much revenue we had lost, and to preserve any semblance of order, especially with respect to jobs and keeping the economy turning over, how much debt we had to go into. And that had put us into a situation where very many people had forecast and predicted that by this time, 2022, this country would have been in dire straits. Fortunately for us, we have come to this year, to this place, without our circumstances deteriorating. In fact, it has improved considerably, largely because of some developments externally and some of the things that we did internally. And we have to appreciate that. This country must understand that a lot of the good position that we are in now, insofar as we are in any good position, it had to do with external developments which were outside of our control, which we benefited from, largely in the form of significantly unanticipated revenues. The question is in the budgeting process is how do we handle that to maintain the benefit of it coming our way? And the answer to that has to be, we have to be cautious. The revenue stream that has come to us in the last few months to allow the Minister of Finance to present a budget in this way, based on the numbers and the performance of our economy, is a situation that carries a label of temporary. Because what has happened to us positively has been so dependent on what has happened externally. We have to pay attention to the external situations to know what our position really is. We have no crystal ball, but history has shown that oil prices and gas prices can go up and down. Energy prices, and it's not an issue only in Trinidad and Tobago, it's a worldwide issue. Virtually every country in the world, what is driving the narrative, the conversation, the social reaction and so on, in every country in the world today is the situation with energy. Fortunately for us, we are in a position to benefit from the changes in energy on one hand, and on the other hand, those benefits have driven up some prices to the average citizen, and we've taken some steps to soften the blow, to soften the burden of energy use. And I want the population to see it that way. I have seen a comment from the opposition who yesterday spoke to you, the media, and that comment was that in other countries, governments are taking steps to cap the burden on the citizens, and in Trinidad and Tobago, we are capping the subsidy. I only want to say to the opposition that if they understood this country's circumstance, they would immediately see the difference between Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the world. Because in most countries, there's no subsidy on energy, on fuel. And the reason why we are having to cap subsidy in Trinidad and Tobago is because we have a significant subsidy. So any response to the energy crisis in our country, we deal with the subsidy, whereas in other countries, they're dealing with the taxes on it or the cost of the market price. And that should make you understand that Trinidad and Tobago, even with the situation that we are talking about, increased prices as a result of reduced subsidies, we are reducing subsidies. So there is an inherent assistance program that exists in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you have any questions, I will take them and try to see if I can assist you further in congratulating the Ministry of Finance for once again presenting to the country a well thought out allocation program, estimates that are realistic, and reports that can tell us that much of what we set about to do in the last years have worked to our benefit, and we are in a position now where we are in to talk about the government overdraft being down at 60% and our GDP, our debt to GDP being at 70%. These were not what many people expected, especially those who bleat all the time that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is unfit for office and that we don't do this and we don't do that. Because there are some people who believe that the only way they can get into office is to bar talk this country. We take that for granted. We know the rest of our population are people who are reasonable. Even in difficult circumstances, even at the personal level, they understand what is going on and that the government is doing its best to ensure that you get the best out of what in effect is a very challenging situation. So if you have any questions, I'll take a few of them from you now. Just tell us who you are and yeah.
So now in the days of social media, you can see the public's response almost immediately to things like the national budget, including people like farmers and people in agriculture. So just to zero in on agriculture, when I ask you if you're satisfied with the allocation, it's really to say agriculture has been such a big thing in terms of us becoming sustainable and feeding ourselves. How do you feel about that allocation and then some of that has been recurrent expenditure?
I am quite excited with respect to what is happening with agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of, if you look at the budgetary allocation, you would see agriculture getting $1 point something billion, and education getting $6 billion. Agriculture in the country is a private sector operation. That's something I don't mix up that. The government takes responsibility for educating the population's children, so education is a government thing. The government also undertakes to ensure that the population has health care and as a government initiative. Agriculture in all its forms, except the odd here and there, is a private sector thing. So the bulk of the expenditure on agriculture is private sector. The government provides technical support and infrastructure support and some marketing support. So when you see $500 million coming from the government into agriculture, that is not the sum total of the expenditure on agriculture. If you want to really get the expenditure in agriculture, you have to determine what are the farmers spending on agriculture, because agriculture is a private sector initiative. And the government does not grow okras, the government doesn't grow cabbages, the government doesn't put up fences. All that is done by the private sector. But they look to the government for help and support. Technical staff giving certain things, the supply of some subsidies to encourage what they're doing. That's what agriculture expenditure is. Controlling water flow, controlling pests. As you see today, the Minister of Finance has stepped in and provided an additional $3 million to focus on a particular pest. But there are lots of other things, starting with a simple thing like plant quarantine, having staff to determine who brings what into the country to infect our plants and animals and so on. So the government is a supporter of agriculture. And that's why the $1 billion in agriculture from the government must be seen in that context. The actual farming on the farm, the sweating on the farm, the hours on the farm, the value of that work is private sector. And it doesn't matter which government is in office. That is what it is. There are times when the government tries to be the farmer. When the government was milking cows in Palo Seco or picking peppers in Caroni, those always come to grief because the government as a farmer, government farms where the government is a farmer is a bad idea. But the government support the farming community.
Do you have any comments on the
I didn't hear his remarks, but I mean, I'm sure that they will be reasonable. Nobody in the budgeting process will say, I got too much. Very few will say, I got enough. And even fewer will say, I will work with what I have. And the majority will say, I didn't get enough. Those are the various tiers. And so I wouldn't be surprised if people, but what I expect them to acknowledge is that there's more money coming into Tobago this year in the coming budget than there was last year. Because of the percentage of the budget, it's a percentage of a larger budget. So that alone guarantees that they get more money. And also some additional provisions which we are putting on, there'll be more activity in Tobago. So that what do you call it, knee-jerk reaction of I didn't get enough, that is normal. That's in the cabinet too, eh? Not just the THA. Yes.
In terms of diversification and agricultural initiatives, do you think that would be adequate?
We have enough money in the allocation to do what we are going to do. And of course, in a few months, 6 months' time, there's the media review. If the work is going on and there needs to be adjustments, there's provision for that. But we do have allocations to do what we will be doing during that year. And again, once I said again, it is not the government that's going to be funding the agricultural effort. The government is a supporter. But there are some things which the government will undertake to do, like that youth program, the agriculture and the shade. Those are things that the government will be doing, and we got, and of course, the presentation on the and that 300 million would be spent on specifics. It's not. It wouldn't be the normal things. So there are a number of things that the government will undertake between now and the middle of the year, which would be government expenditure, right? And we've allocated money for that. So if we run out of money in that program, then we'd have done wonderfully well, because the money is not just spent because of a passing day. The money is spent on something. So, and the same thing with the budgeting throughout. Those budgetary numbers that you see there in the development program and in the other kinds of programs, they have to be spent on something. And if that thing is not done, the money will not be spent. It will be wired into something else. So what you need to look at when you have this budget, which is really an estimate of what you're going to do, revenue coming in and expenditure going out, is if that money is spent, you can reasonably make the assumption that the thing that it was meant to do is done, whether it's in the Ministry of Health or in agriculture.
Now, I noticed that the government managed to pass an almost balanced budget. There is a deficit of $1.something billion in the plan put forward by the finance minister. With the possibility of recessions in Europe and the United States, which the finance minister did mention that could lower the fuel prices, does the government have a buffer in that event that would keep the deficit down?
I won't see it like that. I will just tell you, when we passed a budget with a deficit of $9 billion, there was one that was 13. There was one budget where the difference between revenue and expenditure was $17 billion, which meant that we had to go out and borrow money to do that. Consider yourself having that situation as against this situation where the deficit is only less than 1%. Any budget around the world, any country, where the deficit is under 1%, is a really good position to be in. And the population needs to take cognizance of that. If oil price collapse and the revenue does not pan out as the Minister of Finance anticipated by the numbers he has used, then it would mean that we will end up in a situation where instead of $1.3 billion deficit or thereabouts, that we'll have a deficit of maybe $5, $6, or $7 billion, which again, we have shown will not kill us, but we'll end up in a debt situation, which is where the debt is larger than we anticipated. But the possibility of it being hugely different is not likely, but it's possible. We don't know what is going to happen with the energy prices, because it is the energy price that is so volatile. And it's such an important part of our budget that with this volatility, if it goes very high, like it did last year, and if it goes very low, as it did in 2020, you can get big swings from $120 a barrel and $8 for gas to $27 a barrel and $2.50 for gas. So that's what it does. That is where our country is located, in real revenues. But I would like to ask the population to take a moment and reflect. Had it not been so that what happened in Europe and what happened elsewhere that pushed the prices up in the last year or so, we would have been in a much more difficult situation, because that is where it was coming out of COVID. We had to borrow a lot of money, and the revenues were not there to wipe it out. So thankfully, the prices, which we don't influence, we can't influence the price, we are price takers in there. Thankfully, we did produce some oil, we did produce some gas, we did get good revenue. As a matter of fact, much of what the Minister of Energy focused on today is our effort in trying to produce more of those products to benefit from a good market that is still existing. We don't know for how long, but common sense should tell us, if we produce more of those products and get more from the market, then we'll be in a better position. And the longer it goes on, we think that it's better for us, providing our production is there to be able to get the benefit of a good market.
They would generally utilize diesel, but do you anticipate that there would be an increase in transportation costs?
In some areas there would be, but what are the options? The reason why we made the adjustment, well, let me back up to the top. It is the government's deliberate judgment, after looking at the situation, that we have come into a bit more revenue, that we will not use all that revenue to only subsidize fuel. Because we could have done that, eh? If we had not interfered with the fuel price at all, $7 billion worth of subsidy would have been required, and therefore the $8 billion that we would have got from the increased market arrangements would have gone straight into it. It meant that we could have done nothing else for the country, including the people who would have benefited from that. And let me tell you, let me go back a little further. In 2014 and 2015, when a government did not do anything about adjusting the fuel subsidy, you know what happened in this country? I think we spent $14 billion in subsidy. That's what we did. That prevented the government from having to face the population and say, I hear you, I know you are having a problem with the change in the price, but it is not the best thing to do for the country. The government saved itself from that by simply spending all that money on fuel subsidy. This government has decided that that is not in the national interest. I hear the opposition in the parliament talking, they're all excited because there will be some pushback from the population with respect to the change in price. They avoided that by spending $14 billion in subsidy. We are saying it is better for the country to have the government cover some of the subsidy, but the users of the fuel also need to take cognizance of the fact that the price of the product has changed. The price of oil has changed. If you have a car and you're buying fuel to put in the car, the government helps you with the price, but it has changed for you as well. So I must tell you, I have not heard any conversation yet from anybody in this country about how we could begin to think about how we operate in an environment where the cost of fuel is increased. People are still buying the same cars without even thinking what the car's performance would be in terms of fuel consumption. People are not saying, well, maybe I could make 2 trips as against making 4. Or, in some instances, look around the world and see how other populations have dealt with it. There are ways of at least thinking, how do I reduce my own fuel costs? In some cases, maybe you can't do much about it, but you can at least, is there any way that I can reduce my fuel costs? Do I still make all the trips I used to make? Do I still go as far as I used to go? As often as I go? Can I share something with somebody? Are there days when instead of driving in, I can take the public transport because we have not raised the cost of public transport. We bought a set of new buses. Right? Public transport is still available for most of the locations in the country. If somebody, and of course, the government in the same budget has realized that if diesel was raised without subsidy on the same scale as the others, all those who are using diesel, the business sector, distributing food, the transportation, distributing materials, they now would have raised their prices across the board. And the same people who would have been hurt by the high price in gasoline would have been hurt additionally by a higher price in diesel, so we decided to keep the diesel price down so that the effect of a high diesel price would not permeate the country and cause price increases at that scale. And for those who are not in that situation but are least able to bear any increases, the government has given a one-off contribution, not paying the bill for you, but a contribution towards it, that all these people who we already know who they are, because they are already on the programs of social service because of their circumstance to have qualified for those programs, we identify them as the people to give $1,000 or $1,200 $1,000 to, so that consider it, they can spend it on anything, but consider it relief from the pressures that you would have got from a price increase if you had paid an extra $10 for a taxi man, but you got $1,000 towards those increased costs from the government. And of course, if you are a person earning a certain salary, the government has given you now an increase in your personal income, so you get a bit more cash in your hand. So everybody gets a bit of relief as the government treats with a problem that is across the board. Everybody uses fuel or is affected by the use of fuel. So a fuel cost which we don't control, the government, I think, has done a good job in spreading out the burden wherever you are in the system. If you are at the very top of the earning scale, then your affordability is better. If you are lower down in the earning scale, earning $7,000 a year, a month, you get an increase in your personal allowance. If you are on social services security income, you get $1,000 to go with it. So everybody has been touched in some relief. You would hear people saying that the government has removed the subsidy. That conversation was so incorrect. We were in the process of removing the subsidy, but we didn't take it off completely. We took it phase by phase by phase. And then we end up now, when we get close to this phase, that this huge price increase come worldwide, where the price of oil and gas has gone up. But of course, you would have heard us say today that we have not touched LPG. $300 million of subsidy on LPG. Again, because LPG is used across the board, especially for low-income households, where that is their fuel for household cooking and so on. That has never been touched. We don't intend to. We intend to continue subsidizing it, and the subsidy is significant. Had there been no subsidy on that, that $300 million would have been paid by the same people who we are talking about. And if you think it's a joke, get on your phone and call your cousin in the Caribbean islands and ask them how much they pay for a 50-pound cylinder of gas. And then you'd realize the extent to which you are being helped in Trinidad and Tobago. You know the price of a cylinder? Huh? About 5 times the price in Trinidad and Tobago. So let us not misbehave here over the changes that are forced upon us. Right? This change in fuel price is not the government doing it. It's the government responding to a product which is priced internationally. And we fortunately are in a position to do something about it. There are some countries that can't do anything about it. In CARICOM, I talk to my CARICOM colleagues all the time. There are some CARICOM countries that cannot do anything about it but just pay the price. And worse, it is a tax revenue measure that they still need the tax, and even in this environment, they still have to carry some tax on it. In developed countries like the United Kingdom or United States, there's a tax on fuel. The United States, there's a tax on fuel. We don't have a tax on it here. So let us not misbehave by people misleading us that, oh, the government should have given you this and the government should have given that. The government has been very, very careful in trying to ensure that everybody who is affected by this, that we try to ameliorate the hardships that come with this price increase of fuel worldwide.
We can do that because we reduce the fuel subsidy. So that's a choice. So either you keep the price of fuel down and you cannot give the increased personal allowance. So that's a trade-off. I think it's a very good example. We would not have been able to increase the personal allowance. And so people who tax go from 7,000 to 7,500 if we had left the price of fuel where it was.
And of course, if the price of oil falls to some significant level below $90, then we adjust things downwards. And that is why we've said that the one-off, the $1,000 grant is a one-off, because it will only apply when oil is at a high level. It is quite possible that the next time I talk to you, maybe in a few months' time, we could be talking with oil at $60 a barrel, or at, God forbid, at $40 a barrel, because we've been there, and it could go. That's how oil price is going. One conversation from somebody that's important, price goes up. One conversation from somebody somewhere else, it goes down, and therefore we have to be cautious in how we treat with the current situation where the price is high and we're getting a good revenue, but of course the high price brings with it certain increases.
And we have another question. Would one of those trade-offs also be that fare increase? Well, I can't call this an increase because people over the age of 60 were not initially paying the tax on the sea bridge. But now there's a $25 one-way fee for them. Some people may say that those are pensioners, those are people who, have...
But the trips, they're pensioners, yes, but the trips, an infinite amount and up and down for no real good reason. There's a cost to it. It's an expensive service. That service is an expensive service. And I must remember, when we bought those ferries, right? When we bought those ferries, those 2 ferries cost $1 billion, which we are paying for on loans. And we did say that now that we have brought you a world-class service, we will make some small adjustment to the cost of travel between Trinidad and Tobago. And again, if you want to make an issue of that, just look and see what other people are paying elsewhere. And you'll know that that is not really a significant cost. It contributes to the reducing the subsidy. But there's still a subsidy of $170 million on it. And $25 is not beyond even the very pensioner who's getting. And if it is, then the pensioner would think twice about going to Tobago 4 times and something like that.
And what's the government's idea behind the increase of the FUL licenses at 100?
The license the license for a firearm is we've increased it from 100 to 200. That is not. It costs more than that to operate the license book in the station. So the other one with the assault weapons, there's a huge policy issue here, which the government is having to confront. That conversation will come in the very near future, but it's to discourage persons from thinking that they have an entitlement to an assault weapon. I could tell you from now, this government's position is that we do not intend to arm this population with assault weapons. People who make them and arm their populations with them are trying every trick in the book to get out of that situation, and they can't. And assault weapons in the population, outside the defense force and the police, is not the policy of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. The PLM government, I should say. We have discovered that that policy was changed without government's approval, and our original position of not arming the population with assault weapons is the policy that we will pursue. And for those who have them, the license is not insignificant, and we are going to have more to say about that as we go forward.
Good evening, Prime Minister,
yes.
everyone.
Sorry, I didn't get. What's the name?
From
You're the new lady, right? You're the new one, right? I'll take a while to learn it, right?
You're talking about reducing fuel consumption, right? What's going on with wood from home policy and implementations for that?
With what?
Wood from home policies.
That is a matter. The government has not set about to have a work from home policy except when we were forced during COVID. When you were allowed to come back out, we are still back out to normal. I don't know that we are sufficiently prepared for that to be a major initiative, largely because it requires certain technical infrastructure and a certain level of discipline. This is Trinidad, and Tobago. So we're not ready for a major work from home policy because some people are not even working in the office. So we have to be careful how we talk about that. But in the private sector, and also if it happens to be useful for the public sector, then we are not averse to it, but we have not really embarked upon that as a major initiative. We still expect people to be at the workplace.
One more question. Mr. Augustine spoke about the inconvenience of the rising fares of the sea and air bridge for persons, specifically students who may be attending the University of the West Indies. Are there going to be any measures or implementations to make this commute easier for them?
Well, that has not been put in place, and it is. You see, you can't tailor the policy to suit every individual. The policy has to be one that will apply across the board. The question is, how much does it cost to provide that service? It's about $700 or $800, and if you are asked to pay $200, that is how it ought to be looked at. It cannot be that you don't like the fare of $200. Because the fare is really a lot more. That fare carries between $500 and $600 per seat. Yeah? And that is why at the end of the year, in fact, it is only the company CAL uses its revenue on its international service to subsidize those seats. And if you are going to make an issue of the cost of $200, you must acknowledge that it is being paid for in much larger measure somewhere else or by somebody else. The other taxpayers, which is what that $600 is, because the government doesn't own any money. Government spends taxpayers' money. Other taxpayers pay $600. You pay $200 to give you the seat. That is how the population should look at these subsidies. And it is in water, it's in electricity, it is in transport between the islands, it is in wherever the subsidy is. It is other taxpayers that pay that for you. And if you are asked to pay $200, and let me tell you something, I would not be surprised at all if, as the Chief Secretary is saying, that these suffering students can't pay the $200. I would not be surprised at all if those same persons call a fetting pigeon point with some rookie man, and they will find the money to go to that fete. Because the priority appears to be not getting to the place you want to go for the reasons the Secretary spoke about, but something else. It's priorities. At this station in our lives, we have to make the priorities, and we have the right to make those priorities. So when you are being asked to do something where the cost is $800 and you are paying $200, you cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that the service is a value of $800. It sounds good to make an issue and try to be the champion asking for people to get it for free. But that doesn't make any sense, because it's never free. Somebody is paying for it. Somebody is paying for it, and that somebody is you, the very person who might be complaining about the person who has to pay it, because it is taxpayers who pay all these subsidies. Because if the subsidy was not being paid, that money would have been in taxpayer account. And unfortunately in this country, that is not how the conversation goes. You have a lot of people, especially a sort of dumb politicians, who have taken us down the wrong road already. Because I think it was a bad idea when we were in a better position to spend $14 billion in 2 years subsidizing fuel. And what did the population do in great measure? Just burn it. Just burn it. A simple choice like choosing when you travel could save your fuel bill. If you get in that traffic at a particular hour for no good reason and crawl into Port of Spain from Sandy Grande, you would have burnt up fuel that if you had chosen to go at a different time, you wouldn't have had to burn up. But nobody thinks about the cost of fuel when they plan a trip in Trinidad and Tobago. Since I was in England in the 70s as a student, anytime we're getting in a motor vehicle to go anywhere as a group, the first thing that comes up is the money for the fuel. Because in England, the fuel is taxed. The government taxes it to raise money. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a system where the government introduced a subsidy, paid it, when there was some levy on the oil companies that covered the subsidy. That's how subsidy started, you know. They put a levy on the oil companies and got a certain amount of money, I think it was 240 million, to cover the subsidy. And the next thing you know, oil price keep rising, and the subsidy moved from 240 million to $6 and $7 billion a year. So the government would have collected the 240 million from the oil companies, having put the subsidy in place, and now turn around, and money that should be used to develop the country was used to cover the subsidy. The last time I checked, that subsidy as a cost to the taxpayers in Trinidad and Tobago used for supporting fuel price was almost $40 billion. And you have to ask yourself, as a developing country with all kinds of things to happen, was that the best way to spend that money? A lot of communities know that don't get water. One of the reasons is that the maintenance of the water systems is not done. So at the same time, you're not spending good money on the maintenance of the water system. You're spending billions of dollars subsidizing fuel. And nobody says, I'm not going to buy this car because the fuel consumption is too high. There's another car with a better fuel consumption. Nobody says, not in our country. And I'm afraid that is where the conversation is going to have to go, because the government's revenues are not infinitely elastic. There is a budget. A budget is an estimate of revenues and expenditure. And the revenues can only take you so far, especially when you go that far and then you go a little further on borrowed money. Because if the money isn't available and you want to do it, you have to borrow the money to do it. And that is why we said, we're not going to spend all of what we get in this little window of increased revenues by using it only to subsidize the fuel. We would like that we spend some of it on subsidy, and it's not insignificant, $2.5 billion. We got let me go over it again. We got in the period additional revenues of 8.2 billion because of market changes. We have already spent in the mid-year review 2.6 billion. Right? That leaves us with about 5-point-something billion. We took 1 billion out under law to put in the Heritage Fund. So let's say, for argument's sake, we're down to 5 billion. We put aside 2.5 billion for public servants. And then we said the rest of it we would use for the rest of the country on the things that the minister spent about today. Education, health, national security, all those things. And of course, $1 billion in fuel subsidy, which turned out to be 1.4 billion. So that 8 billion is gone, it's done. That is how we apportion it. And the two of the biggest hits on it, one is the Heritage Fund, which is in fact a savings, but it's called expenditure. Put it in the savings. The other is over 1.4 billion on it's almost 2 billion on fuel subsidy. And of course, a 2.5 billion for public servants available immediately, we say. So that is how the increased revenue has been spent. So if people are saying, I need more, I need more, I need more, that more is saying, don't do that, give me more. Don't do this, do this. It's very simple. But we never hear what we are supposed to not spend it on, so as to be able to spend it on the claims. We never hear that. But when I sit down with the Minister of Finance, that is what we have to do. Because the reality is at the end of the month, or whenever the call is made, the check has to be supported by money in the bank. Not by simply saying, I need more, and give me a long story about why you need more. We all can do it some more. But there's a limit to what the budget can support during this 12-month period. Okay?
We saw that teachers threatened to stay home today. Of course, the Ministry of Education succeeded in its injunction filed to prevent that action. The government is not moving from the 4% being offered to
I don't call it pushback, you know. I mean, people have different. When I wake up in the morning, in the job that I have, my job is to ensure that I make the best decision under the circumstances for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, as is said in the oath of office, upon which I'm about to enter. That's the oath of office I have. And I don't have any problem with people advocating the best for them from where they come from. But at the end of the day, there has to be reason. The only reason why the government has said that 4% is the offer is because the government has found in its deliberation that that is what the country could afford. And if there is no agreement on that, as it appears as though there is no agreement, so far there's only one union that has accepted it. If the other unions don't accept it, there's provision for dealing with that. But the final decision is not mine or the government's. The final decision on whether that 4% is the best that the country can do is not the government's. It's a matter for the industrial court. And that's why the industrial court is there, so that in situations like this, where the government and labor cannot come to an agreement after reasonable discourse and negotiations, then it goes to somebody else who doesn't have any axe to grind, because the government will be accused of all kinds of things, of being wicked, of being this, of being that. But the constitutional arrangements, the institutional arrangements are there. I expect that I would love to be able to give public servants more, actually, because I know the argument that they're making, that they haven't had a pay increase for a long time. Neither have many of us. But the bottom line is, public servants have not had a pay increase for a long time. But it all boils down to what is affordable. We just got some money. We can give you $2.5 billion of it. It's 4% in respect of what you're claiming. You say you want 10%. I would love to give you 10% or 15%, but it's not available. And therefore, we're going to disagree. And then when we disagree, there are provisions for somebody else to make that decision. And when that decision is made, it will bind the government and it will bind the unions and the employees. And so therefore, there's no need to really try to make it so unpleasant that we can't live in this place. I would love to have the country in a position where we can give, as we've done before, a substantial increase. This government that I am head of, we borrowed $6 billion and paid public servants. Borrowed. Because public servants were entitled to it and the money was not there, and we borrowed it. That has to be paid as we go forward. And of course, even as we've done this budget today, if tomorrow we settle with the public servants or whoever else we have to settle with, we have to go and borrow the money because it's not in the kitty. So that is how I would like it to be seen, in a reasonable way. And just remember that there's nothing that I would have loved better than to be able to give public servants a big pay increase now that everybody happy. They get a big pay increase, they get a big back pay. It doesn't end there. If you contract to pay more going forward into the weeks, the months and years ahead, I saw something today which tells me, as a matter of fact, which tells me that in 6 months, there could be substantial changes in the oil price and the gas price in 6 months. And therefore, as we go forward, we have to be careful what is in front of us, not just what is by our nose, but what is way ahead of us that we are moving towards.